Hi, I'm Molly Turner. I teach urban innovation at UC Berkeley. I started the public policy team at Airbnb. I'm on the board of Spur, an urban policy think tank based in San Francisco, and I'm on the TechEquity Collaborative's Housing Policy Committee. I will be interviewing Supervisor Jane Kim for the TechEquity Collaborative today. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't we jump right in?
Sure.
Ed Lee will be remembered in large part for his work to grow San Francisco's tech economy. He created incentives to attract tech businesses to the city, which you supported at the time. What elements of his policy will you retain and what will you change?
So Mayor Ed Lee actually and I worked on the mid-market tax exclusion in 2011. It was actually legislation that I authored and carried through the Board of Supervisors. And we did it at the time when we were at the depth of an economic recession and jobs was the number one issue amongst the electorate. We knew that employers were thinking about staying in San Francisco and struggling to find office space to inhabit. And mid-market had the highest commercial vacancy rate in the city, close to 30% at the time. And so we worked on carefully crafting a narrowly tailored tax exclusion, payroll tax exclusion for companies that are willing to move into buildings that have been vacant. And Twitter actually moved into a building that had been vacant for 50 years and gave them an exclusion only on the net new jobs that they created in the corridor. And this then attracted other companies to come to the corridor, like Uber and Square, who moved into a building that didn't have historical rates of commercial vacancy, and they were not eligible actually for any of the tax exclusions. I think that it's important for everyone to have a seat at the table. This is all of our city, and I want to make sure that our growing tech sector, which has been the largest engine of our economic growth over the last decade, certainly has a place. And I'd also like tech to be a part of the solution, whether we are addressing the housing crisis or the affordability crisis or the crisis of how we regrow our middle class. I think that every industry can play a role in that. And one thing that I want to push our private sector on, including tech, is to think about how they treat and pay their lowest paid workers, their janitors, their security guards, their cafeteria workers. We have poverty, but the vast majority of Americans are economically insecure, and we need to do more to ensure greater security. In fact, the fastest growing population in our homeless count in San Francisco, but also New York and LA, are actually homeless working families. It's single mothers with jobs and children. And we have a huge moral conundrum when people who work can't afford to live in the communities that they serve. And so I think we all have to take a role in taking accountability and responsibility for how we regrow our middle class and address the growing income gap in our region.
Okay, so I'm hearing have tech companies pay their lowest skilled, lowest paid employees more. Any other specific ideas about how the tech community and the tech companies can engage in the future of San Francisco?
Well, it's not just paying them more, it's actually reconsidering business practices that tech is not the only one to engage in, but all companies do, which is contracting out. So when you contract out your lowest paid work, it's a race to the bottom. The company with the lowest bid wins, and they win because they're paying their workers the least. And so we, I believe, and I know Silicon Valley Rising and other groups are working on that, is to help tech companies that have made it, right, to push them away from W-9s into W-2s. It's not just janitors, it's your engineers and programmers as well. And so we have to rethink how we employ people to make sure that everyone can afford to live in this great region. But I also want to make sure that we're working with all of our industries. As a progressive candidate, we're often sometimes viewed as anti-business. I'm not anti-business. I want our businesses to stay here. In fact, I'm very proud of the initiative that I led to make City College free for all of our residents. And San Francisco is now the only city in the country to have made community college free for all of our residents. We're able to do that because of the tremendous wealth in our city. We passed an ultra luxury real estate transfer tax in 2016 that has allowed us to make City College free beginning in August of 2017. And so we were able to do that because we had a great economy. We just want everyone to participate. And I always remind folks that this work is not altruistic. We are all better off. I am healthier, I am safer when my neighbors have access to affordable college or childcare or housing.
So it seems like the recession was ages ago, and it really was only a couple of years ago. There's a reasonable likelihood that the next mayor is going to face an economic downturn during their tenure. What would you do to prepare for a dip in the economy right now?
Well, having been an elected official on the school board and on the board of supervisors during this recession, I remember how painful it was. We were cutting to the bone. We were cutting things that we needed: teachers, pencils, services to seniors, and meal programs. As the economy came back up, we spent a lot of time ensuring that we were setting aside funds into 3 different budget stabilization reserves, and we have been growing that fund over the last 7 years now, because we don't want to be put in the same position again. So we have to even out our economic cycles, ensure that we're saving in good years and building up a very strong reserve so that we don't have to cut to the bone again in the next economic recession. But I agree, I do believe the next mayoral administration will be overseeing a recession, and we have to make sure that we are prepared for that.
Thank you. So the issue that is most urgent to our members, and I would imagine most San Francisco voters, the housing crisis. It's the TechEquity Collaborative's top advocacy priority this year. What's your view on how we can solve the housing crisis and make San Francisco and the Bay Area a more affordable place to live for everybody?
So housing and land use has been my bread and butter, largely in part to the district I represent. I represent the South of Market, Tenderloin, Mission Bay, and Treasure Island. The district I represent currently oversees close to 80% of all of San Francisco's residential and commercial growth. And I'm also proud of the fact that our district is building 54% of all of San Francisco's affordable housing. And that has been due to the work of my predecessor, but also myself. In the 1980s, government made this decision that the market should take care of housing everyone: the wealthy, the poor, the working class, and the middle class. Previous to that, actually, we used to invest in housing. We used to be in the business of building housing, and HUD's budget was larger than the Department of Defense. And the federal government in San Francisco alone, at our height between 1940 and 1980, built close to 6,000 units of publicly subsidized working class and middle class housing. Since 1980, after Reagan began to slash HUD's funding, and it was slashed by 50% over 3 presidential administrations, we began to see homelessness emerge as a crisis in cities across the country. And since 1980, the federal government has only built 1,000 units of publicly subsidized housing in San Francisco. In the 1970s, we used to have more public housing units than people on the wait list. Housing has to be subsidized. We have a housing crisis and we have an affordability crisis. We need to build more, and San Francisco has been doing its part. And we're currently building at 200% of the market rate need. And we should continue to build because we are growing rapidly. However, we are not building enough affordable and middle-income housing. And so not everyone is finding housing units in this Bay Area economy. I work a lot with developers. I look at back of the envelope numbers. It simply does not pencil out for developers to build, even for middle-class families anymore. They won't get the financing, and they actually just won't build for those groups. And if we ever get to the point that we saturate the market with market rate housing, I believe that development will stop in San Francisco simply because of financing, not because of any of the entitlement processes that we have here in San Francisco. We have to go back into the business of subsidizing housing again. We need to strengthen rent control. We have to strengthen tenant protections. And I'm a huge supporter of Proposition H, right to counsel. We have an eviction crisis across the country. It is not just San Francisco. And we have a crisis where many Americans can't afford to rent or buy a home. And we have to really reconsider how we fund housing. And so I'm interested in looking at a major bond. I'm also interested in looking at other types of gross receipts measures that we can utilize to address the affordability crisis in San Francisco.
So I'm hearing a focus on increasing funding for subsidized housing through some of these initiatives you just proposed. What would you do about other forms of market rate? You mentioned middle income housing, which would not be subsidized.
No, we do subsidize middle income housing now. That is how expensive housing has become. We now subsidize housing for households of 4 that make between $80,000 and $150,000 a year. I never thought when I got on the Board of Supervisors that I would fight to subsidize housing for people with very good incomes in San Francisco. But that is how expensive our city has come. We do subsidize housing for the middle class now, and we have to greatly increase that pot of funding. Now, with market rate development, I have approved and supported the most housing development of any city legislator over the last 7 years. And I work very closely with developers to make sure that we can come to a point that we can support their development. Now, I do ask our developers to do a lot. I want them to build more affordable and more middle-income housing. And in 3 different projects in my district, major projects where we vastly increase their height and density, thereby giving the developer money, because when you increase height and density, you are inferring additional value to land, right? Where they can now rent or sell more units than they previously could have under our zoning requirements. In exchange for conferring value, density, and height, I asked the developers to build a greater proportion of their housing dedicated to low-income and middle-income families. So the first project where we achieved 40%, the Giants parking lot, Seawall Lot 337, we increased their height and density. In exchange, the Giants are now building 40% of their units on site, largely for middle-class households that make between $80,000 and $150,000 a year. So we are subsidizing middle-income housing now.
So would you advocate for increasing height and density for new housing developments everywhere in the city or specific neighborhoods?
So I support height and density in exchange for increasing developer obligations. Mm-hmm. So height and density is money. We give developers money. In exchange, we want those developers to share that value back with the city by building an increased percentage of affordable and middle-income housing. Now, the Giants could have just built 12% affordable housing. By increasing their height and density, we're able to win 40% affordable and middle-income housing.
And would you support that throughout the city or just in the central areas of the city?
I have supported it in every development that I've worked on.
Okay, in your neighborhood. Okay, let's move on to homelessness. We also have a massive homelessness crisis in San Francisco. Do you think the city's current budget allocation is adequate for addressing this? And what new solutions would you propose to addressing the homelessness crisis?
We focus a lot on the 7,000 homeless count number, but our homeless count number is far larger. It's closer to 20,000. We have 20,000 unique individuals that interface with our homeless support services system on any given year. However, homeless count, which is a point-in-time count of how many people sleep on our streets or our shelters on every given night, is about 7,000, which means not everyone who's homeless sleeps on the streets every single night. As I mentioned earlier, our fastest growing demographic is families. It's working families. And so we have to do a tremendous amount both to preserve rent control housing, build more affordable housing, and also vastly increase our rent subsidy program. Mm-hmm. This, again, was something that the federal government used to invest in. It's called Section 8, and we have since vastly divested from that program. Now, of the 7,000 in our homeless count, we estimate that roughly 3,000 are chronically homeless. And these are the individuals that most people identify as the homelessness crisis. They sleep on the streets almost every single night. They're usually struggling with mental health illnesses and often substance abuse as well. I believe that we can address at least 50% of this. We can build 1,500 more shelter beds, and we can build shelter beds that are staffed by nurses, clinicians, and psychologists, which many of our shelters are not. I stayed in one of our shelters because I want to understand what this experience and system was like for many people living on the streets, and it is incredibly bureaucratic. And the shelter system is not built for the demographic that's coming in. It's built for someone like me, young, able-bodied, but down on my luck. Those that are staying in our shelters are far older and far sicker than many of us realize. After that stay, I did a couple of things. One, I fought to get full-time nurses in all of our single adult homeless shelters, and they now exist. And my last project with Mayor Ed Lee was to build a 24-hour medical shelter in my district, which we cut the ribbon in December. And it's a shelter staffed by nurses, clinicians, and psychologists. Because I also learned that night that if you are really sick, we kick you out of shelter because we don't want to be liable for you. We have to treat chronic homelessness as a public health crisis. And I want to work with Department of Public Health to greatly expand our medical services to homeless folks on the street.
Why should TechEquity members vote for you for mayor?
Yeah, I've been proud to serve our city a little over the last decade, serving on the school board and on the board of supervisors. I'm proud of the legislative accomplishments that I have been able to be a part of for the last 10 years. I led the initiative to make San Francisco the only city in the country to make community college free. I have negotiated and won more affordable and middle-income housing than any city legislator on the board of supervisors, and have worked to raise our minimum wage to $15 an hour. I am committed to working on a city that is regrowing its middle class again. we have a shrinking middle class and the fastest growing income gap in the country, according to the Brookings Institute. And I think that this is actually one of the greatest challenges facing our city today. And the question that gets asked is who gets to live here? And I hope that we can all work together on making this a great city for all of us, but a great city that all of us can afford to live in.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Molly.